I believe that the internet has been a great project and has enabled an enormous miracle of psychic togetherness, of collective thought, of being able to understand the intuitive thoughts of people we might otherwise have never met. Would non-human animals like the experience? I'm Stephanie Boulding, and this is Ephemera. I like the internet. You probably do too, if you're listening to me. The fact that you're listening to my podcast is itself something that could have only happened online. The psychic connection that it enables is truly incredible. We can connect to minds other than our own, minds that are different from our own. I want to talk a little bit this episode about the field of ACI, that's animal-computer interaction. It's pretty niche. It is what I want to talk about, though, because I think that it will be a really illustrative story that will allow us to better understand the state of the field and the state of communication between humans and non-humans. There's a bunch of research about horses because people are willing to invest money into automating systems for expensive horses. Horses are interesting, actually. They're the only domesticated prey animal. Cats and dogs are both predators, like us. We'll talk about one famous horse from history, and I'll link to some other stuff about modern horse research in the show notes, but I want to talk about all kinds of animal cognition and language. First, I want to open on and set the scene with something that academic Clara Mancini wrote in her Manifesto on animal-computer interaction.
Since we have trained them to do so for a long time, of course, we know that several species can use interactive devices of one kind or another, sometimes appropriating them in interesting and unexpected ways. More generally, though, we now know that many species have sensory faculties superior to ours, possess sophisticated cognitive abilities, engage in advanced problem-solving, use purpose-built tools for complex tasks, communicate through articulated languages, experience a range of emotions, form complex social relationships, make moral judgments, and hand down cultures through generations.
It's a beautiful way of seeing. We're going to go on a journey of fantasy, so some of this is going to come across as weird and stupid. I have to say that, in my opinion, after a couple of months of looking into the field, I do have to say that despite a pearl of the sublime in there, it is currently weird and stupid and flawed. I don't want to be mean to this researcher who I found on YouTube. His name is Tanner McGee. He seems very nice. But I found his Zoom presentation about his paper archived on YouTube, and I watched it. And if this is representative of a sort of typical postgraduate level of experimental design in the field, I am absolutely not impressed. His experiment partner is his own dog, Joe, who likewise seems completely lovely and might even be a better experimental designer. And he's very handsome, a golden retriever. Good boy, Joe. The structure of the experiment involves comparing Joe's reaction to Tanner and comparing that to Joe's reaction to a recording of Tanner. It's supposed to figure out whether or not Joe responds at a different speed, with more or less of a delay, or just differently, to a computer recording of his human's command. But in the footage Tanner shares, Joe just barks at it. As Tanner explains,
It's pretty obvious, right, that they were all failures, all the trials. Joe did show some type of interaction with the system, so he wasn't completely oblivious to it, which is extremely encouraging in my opinion, and you know, keeps me hopeful that if I were to continue this experimentation, that there would be potentially positive result in the end.
If that's the future of animal speech research, honestly, it brings me no pleasure to announce that its past is equally disappointing, although a little more illuminating. There are, of course, delights, beautiful jewels of cognition, but by and large, I think we focused on the thinking animals that are the most easily recognizable to us as humans, even if we might be completely wrong about whether or not that's actually the case. For an example, I want to go back to 1905 and a horse named Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse, eventually bought and acquired by a mathematician named Wilhelm von Osten. Von Osten spent 4 years training Hans, who he believed to be a, quote, thinking animal, before exhibiting him on the world stage. As Laasya Samhita and Hans Gross recount in their article, the Clever Hans phenomenon revisited.
The horse could count the number of persons in the audience, perform arithmetic operations, read the clock, recognize and identify playing cards, and knew the calendar of the whole year. In response to a question, he would tap with his hooves either to indicate a number or the right option among many given. The obvious guess was that this was an elaborate hoax, set up through some means of training between horse and master. It soon became apparent, however, that Hans answered not only his trainer, but cooperated even in the absence of his master, with any person he had never seen before. When he was shown a picture, Hans spelled the name of the painter. Similarly, he was able to identify the composer when melodies were played. Even rigorous questions of critical skeptics were answered correctly.
And here's a YouTuber explaining how psychologists of the day discovered that Clever Hans wasn't actually able to name famous composers.
If Hans wasn't getting the answer through language, maybe it was through sight. So, Stumpf and his team hid von Osten from Hans's view with a sheet, and von Osten would ask the questions. Lo and behold, Hans couldn't get any of the answers right. Then, they duplicated Hans's inaccuracies with other people. So, what was going on? Well, some people would assume that von Osten somehow figured out signals to give Hans intentionally. The consensus is that von Osten was just as clueless as everyone else.
It's notable that von Osten wasn't aware he was directing the performance. As Oskar Pfungst, the psychologist who dedicated a year and a half and several horse bites to discovering the secret too, as he titled his book, The Horse of Mr. Van Osten, as Oskar Pfungst describes.
In the case of unintentional signs, on the other hand, one had to deal with the fact with which physiologists and experimental psychologists are especially familiar, viz., that our conscious states without our willing it, indeed even in spite of us, are accompanied by bodily changes which very often can be detected only by the use of extremely fine graphic methods. The following is a more general instance. Every mother who detests the lies or divines the wish in the eyes of the child knows that there are characteristic changes of facial expression which are, nevertheless, very difficult of definition.
Hans was drafted as a warhorse in World War I and was likely eaten by starving soldiers. An ignominious end for un cheval si célèbre. Oskar Pfungst discovered that Clever Hans needed to be able to see his questioner, as well as discovering that said questioner could be any person who knew the answer to the question he was asking. An inquisitor who didn't understand art history could not successfully prime Hans to answer questions about it. Laasya Samhita and Hans J. Gross again.
The take-home lesson of the Clever Hans phenomenon is still valid, but is unfortunately not respected by all members of the ethological community. During all studies of animal behavior, any face-to-face contact between the examiner and the experimental animal should be strictly avoided. Otto Kohler was the first to postulate rigorously that any face-to-face contacts should be rigorously avoided during such animal experiments. However, many important experiments, e.g. with counting gray parrots, with dogs, with dolphins, and with many other animals, have in general been performed under face-to-face contact, and are therefore at least partly of questionable value.
This is where I have to, unfortunately, and I'm a little sorry about this, but also a little excited to get to do it, I have to shatter some misconceptions that you probably have about talking animals. So, a while ago I had this conversation with a coworker about talking dogs, and I was like, oh yeah, I follow this woman, she's a speech-language pathologist, an expert on language acquisition and formation in non-normative minds, like 1-year-old babies, nonverbal autistic people. Her name's Christina Hunger, and her dog's named Stella. She's a scientist who decided to raise her dog with these, talking buttons, and at this point, my coworker interrupts me and says, "Oh, I love that dog, but her name is Bunny, right?" So it turns out that the dog that I've been following on Instagram is not the talking dog, but merely the original talking dog on Insta. And the other one is later and on TikTok, and I'm like, oh my god, I had no idea. I fucking hate TikTok. But definitely, Christina Hunger was first, because I remember watching her videos about designing the system and her clinical experience. It's not like she's some nobody. She has however many followers, and she wrote a book. But it turns out that Bunny, the talking dog, whose owner is not a speech pathologist, who admits she's not an expert, but is just someone good at TikTok, she dwarfs that with 1 million followers on Insta and oh my god, so many TikTok followers. I know everyone on TikTok has 50,000 followers if they're even a little bit interesting, but this dog is so famous. Anyway, Bunny is, unfortunately, a clever Hans. I'm sorry. Stella also seems to be a clever Stella. Christina Hunger actually admits that Stella's speech is probably composed of a majority of operant conditioning from her own training. You might not like this one, but Coco the gorilla, who knew American Sign Language, she's another clever Hans. I'll say this, she did know sign language, but Dr. Penny Patterson, who raised and interpreted sign language for Coco, was very interventionist and present in the interpretation process, prompting and selectively interpreting Coco's signs, even talking right over Coco's signs and pretending that she meant to sign this. I'm sorry. If this is personal, I'm sorry. I've linked an article about it in the show notes, as well as the chat log that Coco and Dr. Penny and a separate sign language interpreter produced for AOL in a 1998 event. It is phenomenal. You have to read this chat log. But anyway, Coco. Did Coco really mourn Robin Williams as was reported in the news after his tragic suicide? They spent one afternoon together, 13 years before he died. The Gorilla Foundation, an organization founded by Coco the Gorilla's human people to represent Coco the Gorilla, issued a press release saying that she
was quiet and looked very thoughtful,
and later became
somber,
and
sat with her head bowed and her lip quivering
when shown a photo of Robin Williams and informed of his death. To me, this represents the opposite pole to the experimental skepticism performed by Oskar Pfungst. It's okay, so this is kind of a niche reference, but it's one of my favorite videos ever made by The Onion when they were making those Onion News Network videos. It's called Scientists Successfully Teach Gorilla It Will Die Someday. Here's the central joke.
The researchers then showed Quigley photographs of dead and dying gorillas while communicating the phrases "you someday" and "no choice."
It took thousands of repetitions, but Quigley finally became cognizant of the correlation between himself and the decomposing pile of hair and flesh in the photo.
To make sure Quigley retains the awareness of his own demise, the team spends several hours per day reinforcing the certainty of death's arrival.
Quigley, you die. You will die soon.
The researchers say at first Quigley could only communicate rudimentary fears about his own death, but he soon moved on to expressing more complex emotions, like indifference and self-hatred.
Jane Hu, writing for Slate.com in 2014, wrote a very beautiful article about Coco the gorilla and Kanzi the bonobo, who could supposedly understand spoken English, that I'd like to read from now. Coco is perhaps the most famous product of an ambitious field of research, one that sought from the outset to examine whether apes and humans could communicate. In dozens of studies, scientists raised apes with humans and attempted to teach them language. Dedicated researchers brought apes like Coco into their homes or turned their labs into home-like environments where people and apes could play together and try, often awkwardly, to understand each other. The researchers made these apes the center of their lives. But the research didn't deliver on its promise. No new studies have been launched in years, and the old ones are fizzling out. These apes are able to communicate with humans, and this alone is testament to primate cognition. But in the past few decades, there has been a spirited debate about whether apes are using language in the same way humans do. One major difference between ape and human communication appears to be their motivation for communicating. Humans spontaneously communicate about the things around them. Adults make small talk with the grocery store clerk about the weather. A toddler points out a dog on the street to her parents. Readers write comments about stories on Slate. Unlike us, however, it seems that apes don't care to chit-chat. And as Herb Terrence, the former foster parent of Nim Chimpsky, whom there's a wonderful early reverse episode of The Dollop, he wrote a response to something published about ape intelligence in the New York Review of Books in early 1980. In that article, he writes this:
Nim's signing, and that of the other signing apes as well, appears to be motivated more by a desire to obtain some object or to engage in some activity than a desire to exchange information for its own sake. First, the ape tries to obtain what it wants directly, without signing. When reminded by its teacher that it must sign, the ape often signs until the teacher complies with its request. The critical question is whether the ape is generating sentences or simply running on with its hands until it gets what it wants. Careful scrutiny of the ape's utterances favor the latter interpretation. Consider, for example, a typical exchange in which the teacher signed, "You play cat," and Nim responded by signing, "Me Nim cat play." Two of the teacher's signs are combined with two general-purpose signs I refer to as wildcards because of their universal relevance. Unlike the sentences of a child, Nim's combinations amounted to unstructured mixtures of signs. Some are imitative of the teacher's prior utterance, others are selected unsystematically from a small group of wildcard signs.
What I've learned from these deep dives into the researchers who've intimately studied animal cognition, not just their published work, which I've read a lot of, but their personal lives as well, is something any pet owner already knows. Animals are intuitively emotional and have a form of intelligence behind those eyes. Even if it's alien to us, we can recognize its presence. And the researchers who spent the most time with these animals who also applied consistent research principles, like Pfungst blind between horse and questioner, or Herb Terrence's retraction of his previously published argument for Nim Chimpsky's grasp of language, they've been profoundly shaped by their experience. Let's talk about dogs. There's actually a lot more going on in terms of research for dogs and computerized interaction between dogs, although it's usually like computerized liaison interaction between a dog and its owner. In some rare cases, there are technologies for letting dogs in empty homes interact with video and sound of each other during the day, playing digital rope pull against each other, for example. Dogs and people spend a lot of time together, and I think a lot of people have spent a lot of time learning and intuiting ways to communicate with dogs. I don't think dogs are stupid. I think they're smart. My mom trains working dogs. And as Clara Mancini states in her animal-computer interaction manifesto, animals have a greater capacity for physical sensory capacity than humans do. The myriad ways that we raise working dogs to support disabled or partially incapacitated humans is a great testament to this. In my research on dog-computer interaction, I was particularly impressed by one study, which trained already competent working dogs to learn 2 additional signal movements. You see, they put a special harness on the dogs with tennis balls, like basically on the left and right shoulder, the flanks of the dogs, like that part of the harness. They trained these dogs to tap left and tap right, a movement of the upper body and head to grab or touch the tennis ball on either side. This was a new algorithmically codable and computer vision detectable kind of movement that working dogs don't generally learn or practice. I think this is a very interesting and super promising type of research. We took these dogs who we know can learn advanced training movements and who are used to working with human handlers, And we train them to detect X and to do Y if they detect it. And it's an additional kind of movement, of signal. The possibilities are really deep here. So again, out of all the studies I read and paid for on dog-computer interaction, I find this one to be particularly laudable, particularly interesting and worth telling a story about. This is a new physical movement taught to dogs who are demonstrably able to learn it, who can perform it regularly, which allows those dogs to map some of their superhuman sensory experiences onto discrete movements understandable by people like you or me, as well as understandable by computer vision. And even in this study, that I think is some of the most truly exciting stuff I got to read during my research, they still ran into the same issues as everyone else.
Finally, when training a dog, eye contact with the trainer is extremely important, and keeping their head still until a cue is given would involve an additional training task. As a last resort, we used a target on the floor during training, but this approach led to the impression that the desired action was to touch the floor and wait until rewarded, rather than a nod-like gesture. None of these obstacles are individually insurmountable, however collectively, they are sufficient to postpone further exploration of these gestures until a later time.
In 2018, a series of researchers in the ACI sphere published a paper titled 7 Years After the Manifesto, Literature Review and Research Directions for Technologies and Animal-Computer Interaction. In the retrospective, they published a truly illuminating literature review, definitely worth a look if you want to get into the weeds on this. It looks to me like Clara Mancini's manifesto has spurred more qualitative research in this sphere, and that research has itself been illuminating. If I had to quote just a single paragraph from the retrospective, it would be this one.
Whilst tangible and physical objects have a long history within animal technologies, the way in which these types of interfaces have been investigated has developed from a purely cognitive and behavioral standpoint towards a more interactive paradigm. Within this area, the largest body of work conducted has been for service and working animals, with recent moves towards the zoo and pet fields. There are clear gaps present within the research to investigate not only new technologies, but also to investigate how animals respond to and can be trained more efficiently towards technological systems that they can hold, sniff, point, paw, tug, and use in both regards towards the interface and multimodal technologies and interaction model. As the ACI field advances, work is currently shifting towards a non-training approach, especially in the context of enrichment, play, or technologies aiming towards giving the animal control. A more animal-centric design perspective in these scenarios has been to deploy the technology and let the animal become with, where no interaction is wrong, so as to iteratively redesign the technology based on the observed interactions in a research-through-design fashion. More research has yet to be done in terms of animal-centered design methodologies to account for these new insights as the field knowledge grows, questioning which user, man or animal, is really in the center of the design.
So I think we're jumping ahead a little with all these research questions, eh? The Clever Hans experiments in Oskar, Pfungst, and Otto Kohler showed that blinded verbal instruction is a gold standard in animal communication experimentation and research design. But the ways we train animals can't handle that. So researchers are largely stuck interacting with their own dogs, at home or at the lab, in limited small trials. I think the field of animal-computer interaction so far has taken as a given that communication probably has the same kinds of meaning to non-human animals as it does to us. It has an eerie parallel with facilitated communication, an Australian pseudoscience that went global in the 1990s. Facilitated communication purports to allow nonverbal autistic, brain-damaged, and mentally disabled people to tap into another well of communication and thereby more deeply express a previously hidden part of themselves. It does this by having a so-called facilitator hold the disabled person's hand and make them type messages on a keyboard. Repeated scientific studies have shown that it's the facilitators, not their clients, who generate these messages. But what's interesting is that many facilitators, like Mr. Van Osten of the horse, had no idea they were directing the performance, due to the idiomotor effect. And just like with Clever Hans,
controlled scientific studies also revealed that if one posed a simple question to a child with severe autism, the child could only answer the question when the facilitator knew the answer. For example, if the facilitator could not see a simple object that the child was asked to name, the child could not name it. Highly trained facilitators who had elicited sophisticated answers from their patients in the past could no longer do so when they were prevented from knowing what the patients were being asked.
Obviously, it's an immoral and repugnant 90s psychological fad, and I condemn it. But I think it shows that even the supposed experts in this kind of thing, that we're still totally obsessed with normative ways of seeing, interacting, and often totally blind to huge experimental biases. I just said seeing and blind. See what I mean? In a sense, and excuse me for this, we've been putting the cart before the story of Clever Hans. I'll leave you with a song by Vashti Bunyan, from whom Ephemera gets its intro music.
In the telling of your story, there is so much that's lost. There's an ocean in between, the seen and unseen, that's as deep as the lost was. To you, so young, I just see a shell. Can't really get the picture. I've nothing to compare. Can't say I understand. I've no hand to lend. You had more than your fair share. For one so young, but you do it all so well.
Ephemera is my passion project, but it's no longer something I make all on my own. Without the support of my patrons, I wouldn't be able to afford my research budget, or spend as much time making Ephemera as good as it is. And it wouldn't sound as good without Miguel Tanhi as the sound engineer. If you like Ephemera and want it to thrive, Patronage comes with a few hours of extra audio and some other benefits, like membership in my Greek chorus. This month, I'm sending deaf person emoji and my sincere thanks to Greg Stearns, Thomas Hale, Shellgame, Salubrious Rex, Carl Wrench, the Bernardosaurus, Heather Turchik, Robin, Ben Mabbott, Meredith, Matthew Bell, Drew Kidd, Alice, Brady Butterfield, Kevin Ray, Al Ostapek, Tank You Factory, Homo Vulgaris, Frank West, and my dear friend, Aidan Day. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. If it's a little late, Chag Sameach. Inshallah, this winter will end and we will emerge into spring. Thank you for listening.
Say hello to the Upweekx, the smart pet camera with Amazon Alexa voice control.
I like smart. Can it spy on my dog?
Of course.